So we're continuing today. I've slightly changed the title. I haven't really changed the content very much, but it seems to fit better for where we are right now. Instead of it being Napoleon in Portugal and Spain, I've changed it to Napoleon and the French versus Wellington and the British. It's not much different because almost all of the battles that the British had against the French during the Napoleonic Wars were in Portugal and Spain, with the exception of a few battles before in southern France once they pushed Napoleon's armies out of Spain, and then of course the Battle of Waterloo, which was when after Napoleon had been exiled. A year later he comes back and puts together an army right away of 120,000 people and tries to start all over again, and he was defeated again by Wellington at Waterloo in Belgium, but I'll maybe mention that as we go along. But I want to give you kind of a background here because so much of the history of what you experience in this region, and even once we get over into the British Isles, has been greatly affected by the events we've been talking about, and this is one of the ones that affected it most. Today, part of what we did, we visited a beautiful a church close, with a Calvary, which is it was a beautifully carved exposition of the life and death of Jesus. And as you walked into the church, there were statues, life-size statues carved on one side of the entryway into the church, and part of them were clearly of a different material. And our guide said the reason is because during, Napoleon's time, during the French Revolution and after, they destroyed a lot of the religious imagery. So there's another example of how the things we're talking about here had a direct effect on the things that you're seeing, and it helps us understand that. But before we get into, Napoleon versus Wellington, and then tomorrow I'll be doing Vikings. I've had a couple of people say, when are you doing Vikings? I want to be there for Vikings. Who doesn't like Vikings? So we'll talk about Vikings tomorrow, and then our last day out of Waterford, we will talk about the history of Ireland and Irish independence. And as I promised you, I hope to give you a better understanding about what the Troubles were all about in Northern Ireland, about the Catholics and Protestants. It's not just that religious people can't get along. There's something historically much deeper than that. So we'll get into all of that. As we talk about Napoleon versus the British, I have to start out with a previous war. The 7 Years' War. How many of you have ever even heard of the 7 Years' War? Well, good for you, almost half. The 7 Years' War, Winston Churchill called it the truly First World War. Because this war, which happened from 1754 to 1763, was worldwide, and it involved initially every major power in Europe, with the exception of the Ottoman Empire. It was primarily two conflicts. It was Great Britain, Prussia, Portugal, and allies against France, Spain, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and their allies. And you need to realize these were back in the days when places like Sweden and Austria and Portugal were major powers. They were very significant. The Kingdom of Sweden was one of the great military powers for hundreds of years in Europe. We don't think about that these days, but the way this broke up, it primarily was Britain against France and Spain, and then it was Prussia against all these other people. So there were kind of two different theaters of war. But the thing that we should be aware of is that this slopped over to the whole rest of the world. There were conflicts in Africa over it, in a number of different places in India. Obviously Russia was involved, so we've got all of Asia. There were conflicts in South America and all of North America. The US and Canada were affected by this, and Mexico as well. The reason why those of us from the United States think of ourselves as being direct descendants of Britain is primarily because of the 7 Years' War, because prior to that, the French had more presence in North America than the British did. But the British won the 7 Years' War, and in the process, they ended up taking over all the property, with the exception of Quebec. Okay, the Quebecois will be very quick to point out that no, we're still there, we're still French. But that's why all of the rest of Canada speaks English as their first language. That's why there's not an equivalent of Quebec in the continental United States, because the English won the 7 Years' War. And in the process, they ended up getting all of, well, at first they had Spanish Florida, and then they gave it to Spain, and then got it back later. They got all of the Louisiana area. The reason we have the Cajun culture in Louisiana is because in Canada, one of the groups of French speakers were the Acadians. They were in parts of New Brunswick and surrounding provinces there. Well, the British were afraid that they were going to be a subversive element during the 7 Years' War, and so they forced them out. And it was quite cruel to some of these people. And they went to other places. Many of them came straight down the coastline of North America and ended up settling in New Orleans and in Louisiana. And the Acadians came to be known as the Cajuns. So that 7 Years' War is responsible for that French presence, or that French flavor to New Orleans as well. So it was a very significant time, a lot of very, in terms of what happened there, when the war started, Britain was having the worst of it for the first few years, up until about 1757. Then the Prime Minister of Britain, and this is important historically, who was William Pitt the Elder, he decided that, you know what, we need to win this war, because if we do, then that will help us in our imperial goals. In other words, it will expand the empire of England. Remember, they got to the place where they said the sun never sets on the British Empire. Well, they didn't do that by just sitting around. So William Pitt borrowed money, and he both paid the Prussians, who were on the side of the English. He paid the Prussians to fight the war, and he also gave money to the American colonies in order for them to raise armies to fight the French and the Indians. In the United States, we still refer to this as the French and Indian War. But in Europe, the title, and in history, the title is known as the 7 Years' War, because the French and Indian part of it was only one part. Well, this was significant because in the process of doing that, Britain actually strengthened the colonies. They gave them money to develop military capabilities, and that came back and bit them later, because the colonies were more than ready to then rise up. Plus the fact that Britain had borrowed so much money to support the 7 Years' War, a little bit later than this, they were worried about how we're going to pay back all these debts. And they said, well, let's make the colonies help. And they had the stamp tax and the tea tax and all these other taxes that the colonies felt so oppressed, and they didn't have representation in the British Parliament. And so the issue of taxation without representation is one of the things that caused the colonies in the United States to go to war against the British in the American Revolution. And because the French had been beaten by the British in the 7 Years' War, they sided with the United States and helped provide supplies and whatnot to the U.S. during the American Revolution. All of that is a direct result of this war that most people today haven't even heard of, the 7 Years' War. All right? This sort of established the foundation for what comes next. And in the same way that Britain had gone into debt by the 7 Years' War, the French had gone into debt, and they had lost. They lost most of their colonies, and colonies were primary income generators to the early empires, to the French and the British and the Belgians and everybody else. So they had lost their colonies, they had lost a lot of the income, they had gone way into debt. So the French people felt the sting of this, because they were taxed more. They had several years of very bad harvests in France. The people were going hungry. Well, the aristocrats weren't going hungry, and the clergy weren't going hungry, and so the common people developed this real animosity against the privileges of the wealthy and of the religious orders when they were going hungry. And of course, we have the famous thing where when told that the people didn't have bread to eat, Marie Antoinette supposedly said, "Let them eat cake." She didn't actually say that, but there was a princess on the other end of Europe who said that. I won't get into that one. But that was the attitude, is as long as we aristocrats have what we want, who cares what the little people are doing? Well, talk about coming back and biting them. The French Revolution was a rising up of the common people in France against the aristocracy and against the clergy, the church of the day. It began, the tremors of it began before this. In 1789, though, there was a gathering of what's called the Three Estates, to discuss Enlightenment principles. The Enlightenment had happened. There was a spirit of liberalism, the idea of casting off rule of the monarch. And within a couple of months after this big convocation being held, the people rioted in the streets. They stormed the Bastille, which was the prison. Now, they didn't release many people. There weren't many people there. But they stormed the Bastille as a symbol of the French government. They decided, they began to talk very seriously at that point about getting rid of the monarchy, of having a republic. And within a couple of years after that, they did declare a republic. In fact, so much so that in 1793, they executed King Louis XVI because they blamed him for a lot of the problems the country had had, and he had not addressed them. They were hungry, they were overtaxed, nobody seemed to care about the little people, so the little people rose up. And that was the story of the French Revolution. The French Revolution is considered definitely one of the most important events in human history, because not only was it a revolution for the sake of the serfs. In fact, they did away with feudalism in the French Revolution. They did away, and in fact, it represented suffrage. Women were encouraged to take responsibility and to vote. It did away with slavery in any French-controlled territories. The idea of the human dignity, those pieces were all there. Unfortunately, they also linked all of those wonderful values with the guillotine, because so many, not only Louis XVI, but so many of the people, including his wife Marie Antoinette, and a lot of the other nobility, and a lot of people, anybody who said anything or they even thought might be saying something against the revolutionary spirit, could be arrested and executed. They reached a point during what was called the Reign of Terror from 1794-95, where a person who was accused was not allowed to present a defense. In fact, they reached the point where they said, there's so many people we need to deal with, we're not even going to have trials anymore. If they get accused, we're going to assume they're guilty. More than 40,000 people, most of them not nobility, most of them just ordinary people, went to the guillotine or were killed in other ways. There was one member of the Revolutionary Council who had gone to Nantes, and he was solving his problem by drowning people, one after the other, and they finally, people were rebelling against that, and they said, okay, you got to stop doing that, come back to Paris. So there were a lot of people were beaten to death by crowds. It was a very horrendous time. That's why the 2 years when it was worst under Maximilien Robespierre, when he was the head of what was called the Council for Public Safety, we know it as the Reign of Terror, he was the one responsible for simply deciding who's going to be killed. They, again, without trial in many cases, or with trial where they were not allowed to defend themselves on anybody's accusation, it was a quite horrendous time. Later on, Maximilien Robespierre himself was sent to the guillotine, which happened to a lot of the people that were so adamantly revolutionary at that point. So this French Revolution was both a glorious time in terms of it established democracy and the idea of republic as being something to attain toward. In every revolution after that, the Russian Revolution very clearly looked to the French Revolution as being their model. It's not to say that I'm either in favor of the way the French Revolution did it or the Russian Revolution, but this became a model that was replicated a lot of times after this. And it did lead to an increase in democracy. Now, what happened was, for all of that, especially after they executed Louis XVI, the other powers in Europe were really alarmed by this, because not only were they did they execute the king, but they were talking about getting rid of the whole system of government that existed throughout all of Europe. And so they got together there were two French Revolutionary Wars that happened between at the end of the French Revolution, but they're Revolutionary Wars where the other powers in Europe got together in two different coalitions at two different times to try to force the French to stop doing all this stuff, and they were not successful. In fact, in 1802, after this time, the French had won victories, and they even convinced the British to sign a treaty to leave them alone, and that lasted for 1 year, till 1803. Well, one of the reasons that they won those two revolutionary wars, the French did, is because of a particular person who comes along at this time, whose name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Bonaparte was made a general in the French army when he was 24 years old. He died when he was 51. He'd spent 6 years in exile before that, so that gives you an idea of how much he accomplished very young. He was born on Corsica, an island which had been owned by the Genoese from, the city-state from Italy. And so it had been basically an Italian location, but then they gave it to France. He changed the spelling of his name later to the French spelling, and he always thought of himself as French. As a young man, he went to military school in France and excelled, graduated at age 16, and became a lieutenant in an artillery division. And from that point on, artillery was very important to Napoleon and his military tactics. He sort of completely revised the use of artillery. In fact, they used to call all of the artillery that Napoleon had in his army Napoleon's daughters. And he had his seal with an N marked into every one of the cannons that they used. But he proved to be a brilliant tactician. At one point, during the French Revolution, they came to him, the people in charge came to him and said, "We want you to invade England," because they were the struggle against England and Britain. He said, "We're not ready to do that because our Navy is not going to succeed." Well, he was smart enough to see the future, because later on, the Battle of Trafalgar, early in the Napoleonic Wars, the French Navy was completely demolished. So he said, instead of trying to invade England, I'm going to invade Egypt. Why? Because Egypt was the route that the British took to get to the jewel in the crown. You ever heard that expression? India was the most important and profitable of all of the possessions that Britain had in their colonies. And the way they got there was through Egypt. And so Napoleon went to Egypt in the hopes that he would be able to conquer Egypt and prevent the British from getting easily to India. Well, he got there and he won several major battles, the Battle of the Pyramids, for instance, but then his ships were, in the Battle of the Nile, his ships were destroyed by the British Navy. Again, it showed Napoleon had been right. They couldn't stand up to the British Navy at that point. He ends up coming back. He wins battles in Austria against the Austrian army, which was one of the most powerful in the world at that point. He wins battles in Italy, drives the Austrians out of Italy. He wins battles in the Low Countries, in the Netherlands and Belgium. So he's winning battles right and left when he's still in his 20s. Then there is, after Robespierre and the terrible time of the Reign of Terror, they had a 5-person directory, it was called. The directory that was in charge of all of France. And they were the ones who were telling Napoleon, go fight here, go fight there, and basically promoting him and supporting him. But Napoleon then led a coup against the directory. They got rid of them because they were the ones that were, for instance, having no due process. They were just convicting people of things and continuing some of the Reign of Terror. So he became first consul, meaning there was a new group of 3 people, and he was the #1 guy. In 1802, he was named the proconsul, or the first consul, for life. And then in 1804, he crowned himself emperor. So they went from executing their king, they lost a king and got an emperor through all of that. But the fact is that France had been through so much bad times, had lost so many battles and so many wars, and was such bad shape. When Napoleon came along, he straightened that out. He won battles, he won wars. He straightened out the economy. He reworked the banking system. He reworked the education system. He completely remodeled the military so that it was successful against much larger armies at that point. And so he was a hero. Everybody liked him because he was winning, and people like winners. So the other thing he did, which was really significant, is he introduced a new law code called the Napoleonic Code, which to this day is is significantly represented in at least 70 different countries in terms of their own law system. Carolyn and I live in Mexico, and the Mexican law, they're trying to change this, and they have in a few places, but the Mexican law is based upon the Napoleonic Code. There are parts of that we have a real problem with. For instance, in the Napoleonic Code, if you got accused of a crime, you were considered guilty until you could prove yourself innocent. That's the reverse of what we're used to. But the point is that Napoleon introduced a law code that people thought made a lot more sense. So in many, many ways, he not only was a brilliant general, he was an extraordinary leader as a young man. But he had huge desires to basically take over the world. There's no question about that. These are just a few of the images. The one in the upper right is Napoleon being crowned emperor. And as I'm saying being crowned, traditionally the Pope would be the one who would crown someone as emperor. But in this case, when the Pope stepped forward with the crown, Napoleon took it from the Pope and put it on his own head. That was a very important symbol for him, is that he crowned himself emperor. He believed it was because of his own abilities and his own success, particularly his military success. This is in 1804. He crowns himself. He is victorious again against some of the greatest battles, battles of Austerlitz and Jena and others, against the armies of the Austrians. He defeated the Russian armies at first, and then came to a peace treaty at Tilsit, and then later decided it was not a good idea to be an ally of Napoleon's, because you were an ally as long as he thought you were useful, and whenever he decided he's going to take your property too, then he would turn against you, and he did that against the Russians. Much to his chagrin later, because when he tried to march into Russia in 1812-13, got caught by the Russian winter and lost pretty much his whole army. Same thing that happened to the Nazis in the Second World War. You know, you don't mess with the Russian winters. But these are just some of the images of his significance. By the way, the traditional idea that Napoleon tried to conquer the world because he was so short. We even have the expression of Napoleonic complex. Couldn't remember the word, I was trying to say concept. Napoleonic complex. He actually was about 5'6", which was an average height at that time. People weren't as tall back then. So he really wasn't that short. We can't excuse it because he had some neuroses about being a short man. But a very, very powerful figure, in the same way that the French Revolution is considered one of the most important events in terms of long-term effect in human history. Napoleon is considered one of the most important historical figures in history in terms of the long-term effect that he caused. Even though he ended up losing eventually twice, he still had enormous impact throughout all of Europe. Okay. Eventually, he was successful in creating, up until that time, the first Europe-wide empire. There are sections up here, for instance, that even the Romans didn't control. From all of Spain, and I'm going to talk about that in just a few minutes, obviously all of France, Italy, the areas of Austria and Switzerland, Germany, all the way over into Prussia, Austria, and the borders with Russia and the Ottoman Empire. That's where he stopped. But Denmark was included in that as well, parts of Norway. So very effective in terms of being a conqueror. Nobody questioned that. As I said, there are two revolutionary wars before 1802, and then after he declared himself emperor, there were 5 major conflicts, and they're very simply called by the fact that at different times, different people would join together into coalitions to try to fight Napoleon and his Grande Armée. The 3rd coalition, 4th coalition, 5th coalition, 6th coalition, and then finally, at Waterloo, the 7th coalition. And they were various assortments of these European powers who had decided to try to fight back against him. And he would defeat one, like the Austrians, and they would sign a treaty and they'd be out of it for a year or two, and then they would come back. So this was the consistent thing that was happening at the end of the 1700s and 1800s. Now, I mentioned the Battle of Trafalgar. This is very important because Napoleon, while he told the Directory when they instructed him that they wanted him to invade England, he very wisely said, we can't do that yet because we can't defeat their navy. He only thought it was a matter of waiting. He actually did expect that he would invade England. You remember I told you when we talked about the 100 Years' War that all of the 100 Years' War was fought in France. Do you remember why? Because the Battle of Sluys, the English had succeeded in destroying pretty much the entire French Navy. The French didn't have any way to get to England. The English still had a way to get to France, and so all of the battles were held in France. Well, that's exactly what happened to the French in the Napoleonic Wars. At the very start, 1804 or 1805, the Battle of Trafalgar, Admiral Nelson was successful in defeating a significantly larger French Navy with very unorthodox tactic. He himself was killed in the battle, but if you know anything about you've seen all the paintings of ships like this, the major man-of-war kind of ships. They would typically pull alongside each other and fire broadsides, meaning all of their cannons on that side of the ship would fire against the other guy, and they keep doing that until one of the other ones is incapacitated. Well, that's the way they fought battles, but not Admiral Nelson. The French line was sailing north, out off Trafalgar, and he decided he was going to sail straight at them in a T formation, if you will. Now, the reason that was thought to be a really bad idea is these ships had almost no cannon on the front. They might have one or two light cannons, but nothing significant. All of their big guns were on the sides. So if he's sailing straight into a line of French ships, they're all able to shoot at him, and he can't do anything about it until he gets right in the middle of them. And the French had never seen anything like this. They didn't know what to do. They're firing all their cannon, but his ships are doing okay. When his ships in two lines get right into the middle of them, then the French, he's literally right in the middle of them. The French can't do anything to shoot at him, but he's got broadsides on both sides of his ship shooting into the French ships. He sank or captured virtually the whole French Navy at Trafalgar. He himself was killed, and the British still feel like that's one of the great tragedies, the loss of Admiral Nelson. But his technique, his strategy was so unique and completely effective. So the reason why all of the Napoleonic Wars had to be fought, even though Britain was Napoleon's hated enemy, he couldn't invade England and fight them there because he didn't have any boats left. In fact, early on in the conflicts, Napoleon developed a strategy of going up and stealing the Danish Navy and using that. Well, the British found out about it, and they sent their fleet up there, and they confiscated or destroyed part of the Danish Navy so that they couldn't. So Napoleon had to fight on the mainland. He couldn't get over to England. So this was a significant step in the whole war. But the most important part of this is, I mentioned the Peninsular War. The Peninsular War is called that because it occurred on the Iberian Peninsula, that is Spain and Portugal, places we have just been. The Peninsular War began in 1807 when Napoleon, because he hated the British, and the British had just won the 7 Years' War, 45 years before this, and he wanted to do everything he can to try to break the British because they had continued to be the worst enemies of the French. And so he declared what he called the continental system. Every country that he conquered, or every country that he could make afraid of him, even if he hadn't conquered them yet, he declared they had to follow the continental system, which meant they could not trade with England or Britain. They were not allowed to do any trading with Britain. Well, earlier on in the 7 Years' War, Britain had come to the defense of Portugal against France, and Portugal owed them a debt. In fact, Portugal and England have the oldest standing treaty between two countries that exists in the world today. It's from the 1300s. The Anglo-Portuguese treaty of the 1300s, and then one just a few years after that, the Treaty of Windsor, which is why you were just in Porto. That's why the Portuguese and the English have always been drinking buddies. They've got the oldest treaties between two countries in the whole world. So even though he hadn't conquered them yet, when Napoleon said to the Portuguese, you have to stop trading with the British, you have to stop letting them use your ports, and in fact you have to declare war on them, the Portuguese said no. And so Napoleon decided to invade Portugal. And in 1807, he did exactly that. His General Junot, with 30,000 troops, marched through, and it was both the French General Junot and also the Spanish, who at that point thought they were allies with Napoleon. So they marched through Spain, get to Portugal. Portugal, it's almost a bloodless takeover, because they're not in a position to really fight against these armies. And they claim Portugal. Well, the Portuguese don't give in. I mean, their leadership flees the country. In fact, they go off to Brazil. I mean, there's other stories about that, because Brazil was their biggest and richest colony at that point. And about that time, the Spanish are saying, well, what do you want us to do now, Napoleon? He said, oh, I forgot to tell you guys, now I'm taking your country away from you. Because in the process of getting to Portugal, he had brought 100,000 troops into Spain. And he said, you now belong to me. And the Spanish, particularly the people in Madrid, they had what was called the Madrid Revolt. They rose up and began a guerrilla warfare. In fact, the word guerrilla, not G-O-R-I-L-L-A, G-U-E-R, okay, G-U-E-R-I-L-L-A, guerrilla in Spanish. It means the little war in Spanish. This comes primarily from the reaction of the Spanish. There were over 50,000 Spaniards who began an aggressive and active guerrilla war against the French. One of the things the French would do is when they entered a country like Spain, they stole whatever they wanted. They took the crops and burned what they didn't eat. They would rape women. They would kill men who hadn't done anything to them. They would take their livestock. It was a pretty horrible thing. They were hated, universally hated. And in fact, when Arthur Wellesley, Lord Wellington, down there on the right-hand side, when he had his British troops in Spain, anybody that was caught stealing even a chicken was hanged. And the reason was, he said, we don't want our troops constantly afraid that somebody is going to come up while they're sleeping some night at a campsite with a long knife and they're not going to wake up the next morning. Because that's exactly what happened to the French. The French lost as many people to the guerrilla assaults at night and ambushes and all of that as they did to in the battles against the British Army. So it was a quite horrendous kind of thing. Well, Napoleon tells the King Charles of Spain and King Charles' son Ferdinand, you have to abdicate. If you abdicate, then we'll let you go. And he didn't, by the way. They didn't suffer, but he did keep them in captivity. And he said, plus, I will reestablish the Catholic Church. Because one of the things that the French Revolution had done is it got rid of religion. You know, the church was not practiced at that point. And he said, I will give you back your Catholic faith if you'll abdicate. Well, they abdicated, and very promptly, in 1808, Napoleon names his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as the new king of Spain. So, and I'll show you a picture of him in a minute. So here you've got the Spanish are now fighting against Napoleon. Not formally, because formally they're supposed to be on his side, even though he said, I've conquered you. The Portuguese had not given in, and so the British. In honoring their Portuguese commitment, they land in Portugal with an army. The first couple of armies they sent didn't do very well. They fought north, they got into Spain, and then a major British army under General Moore was defeated and had to flee to the coast. And how many of you all went to Coruña? Did any of you go to Coruña when you... Okay, Coruña was where the British army fled to because, of course, they still had a navy. So as long as they could get to the coast, they could be taken off, and they did. But then, to Napoleon's eventual chagrin, another young general was brought in by the name of Arthur Wellesley. He proved to be the only general that never was defeated by Napoleon himself. In fact, there were very few battles that he didn't win against any of Napoleon's marshals, because Napoleon had created a new system of army where he had marshals who were independently responsible for various armies. Well, Arthur Wellesley, who later, because of his success in the Peninsular War, was made Lord Wellesley, and he continued to be promoted and given more, more salary and retirement benefits and properties and everything else. He was consistently successful against Napoleon. Now, Napoleon only came down into the Spanish properties once, and that was when they needed to drive off General Moore, and he came down and saw the British off at Corunna, and then he went back to France and never came back again. He thought his other guys should be able to take care of this. The reason why the Peninsular War was important is because Napoleon himself later on referred to it as the Spanish cancer. At various times, Napoleon had to have between 130 and 220,000 troops in the Iberian Peninsula just to keep from being completely defeated and thrown out. And he wasn't willing to do that. You have to understand that 220,000 troops is the most that the British ever had at their largest, whereas Napoleon, his whole army at one point was over 1 million people. So the British were outnumbered almost 5-1, and yet they consistently, under Wellesley, or as he became known later, Wellington, was consistently successful against them. These are some of the major battles. Corunna being one of them. We just mentioned that. That's where we were earlier. But battles in Lisbon, I'll come back to Torres, Vedras in a minute. Vimiero, Pasaco, Fuentes de Honoro, Ciudad Rodrigo, Salamanca, Talavera, Badajoz, Albuera, Burgos, Vitoria. Those were all major battles between the French and the British won all of them. There were only smaller skirmishes. They always were outnumbered. They always had fewer cannon, and yet their tactics and strategies, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, was always successful against them here. Whereas all the other armies, much larger, much more experienced, much more feared armies all over Europe were being defeated, the British, consistently under Wellesley, was able to defeat Napoleon. Now, I'm going to get into a little bit of military tactics here, because Napoleon revolutionized European warfare. In fact, warfare from then on. He introduced the conscription system. He drafted people. He was the first one to advocate total war, which meant all of the industrial capabilities of France were committed to trying to proceed to prosecute the war. Not just the war budget, but the whole country was involved in this. Total war. He believed in destroying another army, not just outmaneuvering them. His approach was that if he had an army in front of them, he would attack part of it and destroy that and then go on to the rest, rather than just line up and sort of move forward and hope to win against everybody. He created a completely new strategy for the use of artillery. He greatly increased the use of artillery. He assigned artillery to every one of the divisions that he had so that there were always artillery present. He almost completely reintroduced cavalry. You remember in the 100 Years' War how badly the knights, the armored knights did? Cavalry had gone out of vogue for a long time. I mean, there were some, obviously they used horses in military, but he reintroduced a number of different uses for cavalry in attack that were very successful. One of the things that he did, which it's one of the reasons it didn't work against the British, and I'll tell you exactly why in a minute, but the way he fought most of his battles is he would take his corps, his corps of groups, break them up into battalions and line them up in mass, levée en masse, which means they would be in a group, a square or rectangle, say 60 men in front and then 30 rows. So 60 by 30. 1,800 men marching forward. He would have 5 or 6 or 7 of these blocks of en masse soldiers marching forward, full regalia, they dress beautifully, they're French after all, and with bayonets and the whole thing, and they're marching forward, and what they would do is in the middle of these blocks of men, levée en masse, there would be boys who were the drummers, and they would beat the cadence. It was called the pas de charge, that they would beat. The English called it old trousers. That was their name for this song. And the drummer boys would beat boom, 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 ba boom, boom, ba, boom, boom, boom. At which point all of the soldiers would yell, "Vive l'Empereur!" So you got 5 or 6 groups of 1,800 men with tall, these bearskin hats, bayonets, cross belts, boom, 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 ba, boom, boom, ba, boom, 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 vive l'Empereur, right? I would run away. And that's what almost every army in Europe did. The shock value of this was extraordinary. Now, in front of these guys, they would have what were called voltigeurs, or vaulters, that would be a picket line. They would shoot at the officers and the sergeants and try to sort of discombobulate the army they were approaching. And there would be cavalry on the sides and back ready to ride in. They had various kinds of lancers and hussars and various other kinds of cavalry. But they mostly just scared the pants off of every army that they came up against. But there was one problem. If you've got 1,800 guys in a square, and you've got 4 or 5 or 6 of these squares, and they're marching forward with this sound, scaring everybody, how many people in those 1,800 men actually were able to shoot? The 60 in the front and the 30 on each side. Maybe 120 out of the 1,800. Everybody else was either behind, they're inside, they can't shoot. So at a certain point, when they got up close enough, and the other army, if they hadn't already run away, they might spread out a little bit so they could shoot more. Well, the British had a very different approach. The British were never as large an army. And by the way, the French, they could see the other armies, because the armies always wanted to look really good, and they would get out there, the Austrians and the Russians and everybody, and the French knew right where they were, and so they would aim these big blocks of columns of men right at the main part of the other army. Lord Wellington, Arthur Wellesley, he used a strategy called the reverse slope strategy, which means he would always try to find a location where he could put his troops on the backside of a slope so the French couldn't see them. And he could move his guys around so the French, as they're marching forward in these columns, they could end up in a place where there weren't any British, and all of a sudden the British were shooting at them from both sides. And the other thing he did was, even though he had fewer soldiers, they would fight in 2 ranks, 2 lines, and by platoon. And so whereas these big columns are marching forward against the British are in groups of platoons, 2 rows, so that everybody can shoot at one time. And they did what was called platoon fire. The British were the only army in the world that practiced with live ammunition. And they required a soldier to be able to fire at least 3 rounds a minute. Now this is when they were loading through the barrel of the gun and ramming the thing down, and it took time. But they would train with live ammunition until the worst soldiers could do 3 rounds a minute. The best soldiers could do 5 rounds a minute, or 6. And when they set up their platoons and these columns were marching for them, they would call for platoon fire. 1 platoon would fire, a second later the 2nd platoon, then the 3rd platoon, 4th platoon, 5th platoon, 6th platoon, everybody. By that time, these first platoons have reloaded. So there was a constant barrage of fire from the British going into these columns of French constantly. And every one of the British soldiers could shoot. It always worked. Even though, new soldiers, they would see this horrendous sight of these French coming forward with the drums and the screaming and the Vive l'Empereur and all that stuff, and yet the British consistently, with fewer soldiers but better firepower, they would defeat them. That was Wellington's work. So the other thing they did was their pickets, their voltigeurs, the equivalent of the French voltigeurs, used rifles. Meaning, if you know what a rifle is, they had grooves inside the barrel. 7 grooves that turned 1/4 turn. So that their bullets were faster and much more accurate, could shoot further. And Napoleon, being an old artillery guy, he didn't like that because it took longer to load those rifles than it did a musket. And yet they proved very, very effective because they could shoot further and they would kill more officers and that sort of thing. Anyway. So now you know all about Napoleonic military tactics. But this is how they ended up winning the British, with smaller forces, less artillery, and yet very effective use of what they had. Wellington was once asked, by the way, to Napoleon's credit, they asked Wellington after the wars, after he had defeated Napoleon, including at Waterloo, where he was hugely outnumbered and nobody thought he had a chance. In fact, Wellington said he would not have fought the battle, except he thought that the Germans under Blucher were going to show up any minute. They didn't show up until the battle was over. But Wellington said, we would not have fought except that we thought they were going to show up any minute, but he still won, right? Even so, when they asked Wellington who the best general of all time was, Wellington said, the greatest general in this age, in past ages, in any age, Napoleon. Pretty good credit against the guy who beat Napoleon every time he was up against him. Wellington once said that having Napoleon's hat on a field of battle was worth 50,000 men. So he had great regard and respect for him, but he defeated him over and over again. This is Joseph Bonaparte in one of his very few good moments as the King of Spain. Because, in 1808, when he was made King of Spain, that was when the Madrid Revolt started. That's when the guerrilla warfare of the Spanish against him started. And that was the year that the British showed up on the scene and started making it very difficult for the French armies. Okay. He later on fled. Somebody told me that Joseph Bonaparte had owned property near them. Who was that? He bought property in the New World, so because it had to go somewhere, right? Toward the end of the battles at the end of the battles in Portugal, toward the ends of the battle, into the battles in the Iberian Peninsula, after the Battle of Busaco. Busaco is where the last of the royal palaces of the Portuguese royal family was, and you can stay there now. It's a hotel. Carolyn and I stayed there. It's an extraordinary place. They have a forest there, Busaco Forest, where when the Portuguese were a world empire, they collected plants from all over the world, and they're now in that forest. It's a beautiful place. Well, just over from where Busaco Palace is, there's a long hillside where the Battle of Busaco was held. And Wellington won that battle, but he realized that if the French got their forces together, he better be prepared to have a defense. Prior to that, he had created just north of Lisbon. This is Lisbon. This is the river Peja here. He had his engineers. The British had very good engineers. Check this out, and they created 3 lines of defense called the lines of Torres Vedras. The dotted lines, this is the first line of defense, the second line of defense, and then he had a third line of defense down here if he had to fall back to that. He had about 60,000 troops, about half English, some Portuguese, some Spanish, that were protecting this. Well, everything to the north of this, they took a burned earth strategy, a scorched earth strategy. They got rid of any food, any fresh water. So Busaco is well up north of this. They retreat down here. The British Army retreats down here behind these lines. The French did not even know that they had built these lines. They were a combination of strong points, that is fortress kind of points, natural barriers, ravines and flooded rivers, ravants, various other kinds of things, with 60,000 troops behind them. The Marshal Massena from Napoleon's forces is chasing after Wellington and his army after Wellington has defeated him, but he's gotten other marshals to send troops. They show up north of these lines, completely unaware that this was there. They had spent 100,000 pounds building this, which is, they say that is the least expensive and most militarily effective fortification that has ever been built. The French did not know what to do with this, even though they called their armies together. They tried assault in one place and got nowhere, and they realized, we don't have any food, we don't have any water, we don't think we can defeat these defensive lines. The only option would have been for them to come over here on the other side of the river and try to come in this way, but they actually built fortifications right along the river too. The French turned around and left. They went back to Spain. And Wellington and his forces went after them, along with the Portuguese army and the Spanish armies. They ended up chasing them. This is the border between Spain and France. These are all of the different towns, but also the various Picton and Pack, and here's Wellington. They had the last major battle here in Spain, which was the Battle of the Pyrenees, in which Marshal Soult, one of the most significant of the French marshals, gathered parts of 4 French armies and tried to attack Wellington. He was driven back, and they finally gave up and said, this isn't going to work, and they turned around and go back into France. Wellington and his troops follow them into France. They fight a number of battles there, and then a short time after that, Napoleon, who has just gotten back from Russia and had his whole army destroyed by the Russian winter, comes back, abdicates, steps down, is sent into exile in Elba. He's there for less than a year and comes back. He lands on the coast of France and puts together immediately an army of 120,000 and ends up marching north through France, gathering the military, preparing, marched into Belgium, and the Battle of Waterloo was his final defeat. He abdicated, was sent to St. Helena under guard, was there 6 years, and died when he was 51. A lot of details there. This has been a long talk, I apologize, but questions about any of that? About the French and the British. The French never really recovered from that. Yes? About what? Okay. Right, how did they communicate? One of the things that Napoleon had done was he had completely revised the field staff strategy. The field staff setup meaning how you've got everybody, all of your commanders on the same page, how you communicated that out, how you knew when to lead, etc. Napoleon was an expert at that. Wellington was as good or better. And so they had to plan that everyone has to be gotten together. We have to say, okay, this is our strategy. If this happens, then this is... So there was a lot of pre-planning that went on. After that, they from time to time would have signals like, okay, if we fire 2 cannon shots at once, that's the time to start. Or they had flares. You know, they could fire flares. This is the first war in history. The French, actually Napoleon initiated, they had aerial surveillance. They had balloons. And they would check, you know, they didn't use them a lot, but they actually could go up and see what's happening in the battlefield. You'll notice in any image that you see of a commander, see where he is? He's on a hilltop. And he's on top of his horse. One of the reasons that officers all rode horses is it allowed them to see more of what was going on. And you'll notice here, he's handing orders to someone. Most of the generals, Wellington for instance, the pommel of his horse was large and flat because that was his writing desk. And so he would be up somewhere where he could see what was going on, and he would write orders, you know, he would scribble orders with a pencil and hand it to somebody with a horse, and they would write it down there and say, you know, you've got somebody sneaking up on you on the left, or we need you to reinforce your right, or whatever. So it was a combination of things. Any preset orders they could actually launch with, as I say, cannon fire or flares or whatever. But for the most part, it was somebody on a horse, and they always had riders around them so that they could be carrying orders back and forth. A lieutenant or a captain or somebody like that would be the communicator. Okay? Yes?
Just to say that there were consequences to these invasions that are part of our lives. One, because of Napoleon, the beaches, all the coast of Portugal, you cannot have private beaches in Portugal because the English with the Portuguese, they needed the control of the coast. So to this day, there is a law, you cannot have private beaches, which is wonderful. The second thing is that where we live, very near Busaco, it was common to find cannon bullets when people were, tilling the land. Very common. And the third thing is that the British stayed on, took over in certain ways at least, and they appropriated the port wine and wool businesses. And the fact is that in a way it was a good thing for the port wine because they improved on it. It became a better wine. So that's why you go to Portugal, and until maybe 40 years ago, you'd find tailors, sandman, brewmaster, cock, all non-Portuguese names. Now it's no longer true, but the port wine comes from, owes a lot to the Napoleonic invasions.
Good, thank you. Yeah, I said that the Treaty of Windsor back in the 1300s was when Portugal and England became drinking buddies. Well, because there was a long period, I don't know if you've ever tried to drink any wine that was made in Britain. They do make a little wine, but there's a reason why you don't want to do that. But the French wine, obviously, that was the location closest to England, and the English still drank some French wine, but they wouldn't even call it by the French name. For instance, Bordeaux, a Bordeaux wine from France. What do they call it in England? Claret. It's the same thing, but they won't use a French word for it. And during the times when they had no access to the French wine industry, that's one of the reasons they developed such close relations with the Portuguese. And I don't know if you've had a chance to drink any, we love port. Carol and I have been to Portugal because we love port, but we discovered in Portugal there are spectacular red wines, for almost nothing compared to what we were used to coming from Washington State and knowing Napa Valley and all of that. So, and you're right, all of these names that are English names got involved in the port industry. But there's always been, again, the oldest treaty between two countries in the world is between Portugal and Britain. And they come to each other's defense still. Any last questions? Today's gone long. I appreciate your patience. Thank you. Tomorrow, it's Vikings.